The scent of freshly brewed espresso mixed with the faint aroma of pastries lingered in the air, a comforting contrast to the fatigue weighing down on Samantha. The cafe, usually filled with energy, had settled into its afternoon lull, a brief window of calm before the dinner rush. For Samantha, however, the quiet was just another reminder of how slow the day had been. She wiped down the last table near the window, stealing a quick glance at her phone. Just one more hour until her shift ended. But her mind wasn't on the time. It was on the stack of unpaid bills sitting on her kitchen counter. Rent was due in 2 days, her phone bill was past overdue, and her mother's medication costs kept piling up. Tips had been abysmal that day, mostly just loose change carelessly tossed onto the tables by customers who never even looked up from their phones. Samantha exhaled sharply, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear before adjusting her apron. She could almost hear her manager's voice in her head, reminding her to smile through it, even when exhaustion clawed at her body, even when the weight of financial stress felt unbearable. Then, the bell above the cafe door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned instinctively, her professional instinct kicking in. A young man stepped inside. He was tall, lean, and carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His outfit was simple, just a plain, well-fitted shirt and slacks, but there was something effortlessly put together about him. 2 men followed close behind, blending almost too well into the background, their sharp eyes scanning the cafe with quiet intensity. It wasn't common to see security in a place like this, and for a second, Samantha felt a flicker of curiosity. The cafe was far from a hotspot for high-profile visitors. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect celebrities, let alone someone important enough to require bodyguards. As the young man moved towards a table in the far corner, something about him nagged at her. His face. Why did it seem so familiar? Then it clicked. Barron Trump. Her heart skipped a beat. She had seen his face countless times in the news, but in person, he was different. Less of the public figure and more of just a person. There was a calmness in the way he carried himself, a sense of quiet observation that felt oddly out of place in a city where everyone was always in a rush. For a brief moment, she felt frozen, but professionalism took over and she quickly grabbed her order pad, forcing herself to breathe as she approached his table. "Good afternoon," she greeted, her voice even, masking the slight nervousness curling in her stomach. "Can I get you something to start?" Barron looked up. His blue eyes met hers, and for a fleeting second, Samantha felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if this wasn't just another customer, another interaction in her long day. "I'll just have a cappuccino," Barron said, his voice polite but reserved, "and maybe one of those croissants." Samantha scribbled down the order, her hands moving automatically. "Absolutely. Anything else?" He shook his head. "That'll be perfect, thank you." His words were simple, but there was something about the way he said them, a sincerity that felt rare in a world where most customers barely even glanced at her. She nodded and turned toward the counter, willing herself to shake off the strange, fluttery feeling in her chest. It was just another order, just another customer, nothing more. But as she busied herself behind the espresso machine, she couldn't help but glance back toward the corner table. Barron Trump sat quietly, his posture relaxed but composed. Unlike most patrons, he wasn't scrolling on his phone, wasn't hunched over a laptop, wasn't distracted. He simply stared out the window, watching the world pass by. Samantha frowned slightly, something tugging at the edges of her mind. Most people like him. People with money, people with influence, walked through life with a certain air of detachment. But Barron didn't. He didn't seem to care that people were whispering, sneaking glances, subtly taking photos. He was just there, present. The hiss of the steam wand snapped her back to reality. "Get it together, Sam," she muttered under her breath, pouring the perfectly frothed milk into the cup with practiced precision. She plated the croissant with careful hands and balanced everything onto a tray. As she approached Barron's table, she felt a strange sense of anticipation she couldn't quite place. "Here you go," she said, gently placing the cappuccino and pastry down in front of him. Barron looked up, offering a faint but genuine smile. "Thank you." "You're welcome. Let me know if you need anything else," she replied, keeping her tone professional, yet polite. As she turned to walk back to the counter, something stopped her. Maybe it was the feeling of his gaze still lingering, not in a way that was invasive, but in a way that made her wonder if he could see more than she was letting on. Or maybe it was just her own exhaustion, making her hyper-aware of every small detail. Either way, her heart fluttered again, and she had no idea why. Minutes passed. Samantha busied herself wiping down counters, refilling sugar dispensers, anything to distract herself. The cafe had grown quiet again, save for the faint hum of music playing softly through the speakers. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something. Barron pulled a pen from his pocket. He leaned over the receipt as his meal came to an end, scribbling something down quickly, almost as if he didn't want anyone to notice. Then, just as effortlessly as he had arrived, he folded the paper neatly and tucked it beneath the empty coffee cup. Samantha watched, curiosity prickling at her. It wasn't just about the tip. There was something deliberate about what he had written. Gathering his phone and coat, Barron rose from his seat. As he passed by the counter, Samantha felt the words leave her lips before she could stop them. "Thank you for coming," she called out softly. Barron turned slightly, offering one last small smile. "Have a good day." And just like that, he was gone. The bell above the door chimed softly behind him, and the cafe fell silent once more. Samantha let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure why, but something about this felt different. Little did she know, the note he left behind was about to change everything. Samantha stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty coffee cup and the folded receipt tucked beneath it. Her heart pounded against her ribs, an inexplicable tension building in her chest. It wasn't unusual for customers to leave notes, sometimes a quick thank you or a casual, great service. But something about this moment felt different. She reached out, her fingers grazing the edge of the paper, hesitating for just a second before unfolding it. And then, her breath caught in her throat. At the bottom of the receipt, just beneath the total, was a number, a tip so large that it made her stomach drop. 4 crisp digits. Her fingers trembled slightly as she processed the amount. She had worked double shifts all week, scraping by on barely enough to cover groceries and bills. And here, in one simple act, was more than she had made in weeks. But it wasn't just the money. Above the tip, in neat, deliberate handwriting, were words that sent a lump straight to her throat. "Your kindness and hard work don't go unnoticed. My family has been where you are. Stay strong. Brighter days are coming." Samantha's knees nearly buckled. She read it again, this time slower. Her vision blurred, and she had to blink rapidly to keep her emotions from overwhelming her. The words weren't just polite. They carried weight. They carried understanding. Her chest tightened as she thought about all the late nights, the exhaustion, the worry about whether she'd have enough to make rent. And yet, someone, this young man, Barron Trump of all people, had seen her. Really seen her. A shaky breath escaped her lips as she clutched the note to her chest, her mind whirling. She had no idea what to do next. Should she chase after him, thank him, say something? But the cafe door had already shut, the faint echo of the bell still ringing in the quiet room. "Sam." Her manager's voice snapped her out of her daze. She turned, blinking rapidly to clear her eyes, but her trembling hands gave her away. Her manager, a woman in her 50s with a sharp but kind demeanor, immediately noticed. "What happened?" she asked, stepping closer, her gaze flickering from Samantha's face to the crumpled receipt in her hands. Samantha opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She swallowed hard, then slowly held out the note for her manager to see. The woman took it, her eyebrows furrowing at first, But as her eyes trailed down the handwritten words and finally landed on the tip amount, she let out a low whistle. "No way," she muttered. "Are you serious?" Samantha nodded, her throat still too tight to speak. Her manager let out a slow breath before looking back up at her. "Who left this?" she asked. Samantha's voice finally found its way out, though it was barely above a whisper. "Barry Trump?" Her manager blinked. Once. Twice. "The Barron Trump?" Samantha nodded again. For a moment her manager just stared at the note, as if trying to process the reality of what had just happened. Then she shook her head, with a stunned smile. "Well," she exhaled, "I guess you never really know who's paying attention." Samantha let out a breathy laugh, but it came out shaky, like she was still struggling to steady herself. Her manager placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, something rare from a woman who was usually all business. "This is something special, Sam." Samantha nodded, still trying to ground herself in the reality of what had just happened. The cafe suddenly felt different. The weight she had carried walking into work that day, the exhaustion, the stress, the never-ending cycle of barely scraping by, felt just a little bit lighter. But what Samantha didn't realize was that this moment, this note, and the simple act of kindness behind it would soon travel far beyond the walls of this cafe. And she had no idea just how much it would change everything. Samantha couldn't shake the image from her mind as the cafe's afternoon lull gave way to a quiet, lingering tension. In that moment, every detail of the encounter replayed in her head like a scene from a film. She recalled how, after serving the cappuccino and croissant to Barron Trump, the young man whose calm presence had filled the corner table, she had noticed him pull a pen from his pocket. With deliberate care, he had leaned over the receipt and scribbled something quickly, almost as if he were protecting a secret. Then, with a fluid motion, he folded the paper neatly and tucked it under the now empty coffee cup. The sight had sent a jolt of curiosity and anticipation racing through her, leaving her with an inexplicable sense of foreboding and wonder. As she returned to her duties, clearing tables and refilling sugar containers, the memory of that gesture kept echoing in her mind. It wasn't just the generous tip, a 4-digit sum that made her stomach drop, but the handwritten note that accompanied it, a message that promised hope and understanding. Samantha couldn't help but replay those words over and over. "Your kindness and hard work don't go unnoticed. My family has been where you are. Stay strong. Brighter days are coming." They felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in daily struggles. A reminder that, even in the harshest of moments, someone might see your pain and offer a glimmer of hope. Throughout the rest of her shift, Samantha's thoughts were in a whirlwind. She couldn't focus on her tasks as she normally did. Every time she glanced toward the far corner of the cafe where Barron had sat, her mind wandered back to that moment, the way his eyes had met hers briefly as he gathered his things. The quiet, "Have a good day," he had offered with a gentle smile, and then his departure into the city, leaving behind not just a tip, but a message that cut deep into her tired soul. Meanwhile, outside, the world carried on unaware of the life-altering moment that had just occurred inside the modest cafe. The busy streets of Cleveland, with their honking cars and bustling crowds, stood in stark contrast to the intimate scene unfolding within. Inside, the soft hum of background music mingled with the faint clinks of cutlery, creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to amplify every whispered conversation and every stolen glance from a regular customer. Yet, amidst all of that, Samantha's focus remained on the folded note, a treasure that had arrived unexpectedly, wrapped in the handwriting of a young man who should have been just another customer. She took a break during a lull in the rush, retreating to a quiet corner behind the counter. Pulling out the note once more, she carefully unfolded it, her fingers trembling as she reread the message. Each word resonated with her deeply, stirring up memories of long nights spent worrying about overdue bills and the constant pressure of making rent. It was as if the note was speaking directly to her, telling her that she was seen, not just as a waitress working a monotonous shift, but as a person who mattered. The thought made her heart ache and swell with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. At that moment, she remembered that she had always prided herself on her work ethic, even when the tips were meager and the hours felt endless. Every day she served countless cups of coffee, cleared countless tables, and greeted every customer with a smile, even when her own spirit was bruised by the relentless pace of life. But now, with this unexpected recognition, she felt a flicker of validation that perhaps her struggles were not in vain. The note wasn't just a compliment, it was a challenge. It said, "Stay strong. Brighter days are coming." And for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, Samantha believed it. The cafe began to fill up again as the afternoon waned, but the buzz of conversation was now laced with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in energy. Regulars who had once rushed in and out with barely a glance were now exchanging whispers about the local hero, who had seemingly captured the hearts of everyone online. Some customers even left kind notes on their napkins or tipped a little extra, as if they too wanted to participate in the silent revolution of kindness that had unexpectedly taken root within these walls. Samantha tried to shake off the overwhelming attention, but deep down, she knew that her life had been touched by something extraordinary. The note had transformed an ordinary day into one that felt magical, filled with possibility, hope, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures could echo the loudest. Every time she caught sight of the folded note, tucked away in her apron pocket, it reminded her that she wasn't invisible. She was seen, and her struggles, her efforts, her kindness, all mattered. The weight of the world on her shoulders felt a little lighter now, buoyed by the belief that perhaps someone out there cared enough to see her not just as a waitress, but as a person with her own dreams, her own hardships. In that quiet moment behind the counter, as the sounds of the cafe melded into a comforting background hum, Samantha made a silent vow to keep believing, to keep working hard, and to let the note's message guide her through whatever challenges lay ahead. And so, as the day came to a close and the cafe's lights dimmed in preparation for closing time, Samantha stepped out into the cool evening with a renewed spirit. The folded note, the generous tip, and the unexpected kindness of a young man had sparked a transformation not only within her, but within the entire cafe. It was a reminder that in a world where people often overlook one another, sometimes a simple act of recognition and compassion could change everything. One small, heartfelt gesture at a time. Samantha barely had time to process the whirlwind of emotions from the note before reality came crashing back down. The cafe, usually a quiet place where customers came and went unnoticed, had suddenly turned into the center of attention. It started with the whispers, co-workers nudging each other, customers glancing toward her table with curious eyes. Then, the first wave of texts flooded her phone. Her best friend had sent a link. "You're all over the internet." Confused, she clicked it. The headline made her stomach drop. Barron Trump leaves heartfelt note and generous tip for struggling waitress. A moment of kindness goes viral. A blurry photo of the receipt with Barron's handwritten message was plastered across the article. Samantha's heart pounded. Who took this picture? How did it spread so fast? She swallowed hard as she scrolled through the comments beneath the article. This is what the world needs more of. Wealth used for good. Respect to Barron Trump. Wow, but what about the waitress? I hope she's okay. Samantha clenched her phone. It was surreal. Just hours ago, she was an exhausted waitress, scraping by, unnoticed by the world. Now, she was the face of a viral moment she hadn't asked for. By the time her shift ended, the cafe had transformed into something else entirely. Customers kept glancing at her, some smiling knowingly. A few left larger than usual tips or kind words scribbled on napkins. Even her manager, who usually kept interactions short and professional, pulled her aside. "You're a local celebrity now," she teased. Samantha forced a smile. "Yeah, lucky me." But she didn't feel lucky. She felt exposed. The real panic set in when she stepped outside. Parked across the street was a news crew, cameras, microphones, the works. A reporter stood by the door, waiting. Her stomach turned. "Samantha, they're here for you." One of her coworkers ran up behind her. She felt trapped. The cafe had been her escape, her safe space where she could blend into the background. Now, the whole world was staring at her. Without thinking, she turned and ducked out the back door. The cold air hit her like a wave as she hurried down the alley, gripping her bag. She needed to get home. She needed time to think. As she walked, her phone vibrated again. Another message. "Morning show wants to interview you. Call me ASAP." Samantha stopped in her tracks, gripping her phone. TV? She felt her pulse quicken. There was no way. She barely processed the day as she boarded the subway. The folded note from Barron sat safely tucked inside her jacket pocket. She pulled it out and reread the words. "Brighter days are coming." For the first time in years, she wanted to believe it, but right now, all she felt was pressure. When she finally stepped into her apartment, her mother was sitting in her usual chair, flipping through the TV channels. As Samantha walked in, her mother gasped. "Sweetheart, is that you?" Samantha frowned. "What?" Her mother pointed to the television. Her face was on the screen. A simple note from Barron Trump has sparked an overwhelming response from people across the country. The camera zoomed in on the words he had written. Samantha's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "This is too much," she whispered. Her mother muted the TV and turned to her, her expression soft. "Why are you upset, honey?" "Because I didn't ask for this," Samantha blurted. "I didn't want to be a viral story. I didn't want people dissecting my life or assuming they know me. It's just too much." Her mother reached over and took her hand. "I understand," she said gently. "But sometimes the good things find us when we're not looking for them." Samantha wiped her eyes. "I just don't know what to do." Her mom squeezed her hand. "Then, ask yourself, what would make you proud? What would you want to say if you had the chance?" Samantha sat in silence, thinking. Her phone buzzed again. Another news inquiry. Another request for an interview. And suddenly, she knew. She picked up her phone and called her manager. "Tell the morning show I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. Her manager gasped. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Samantha said. "But I'm not going to talk about the money. I want to talk about the note, about kindness. That's all. Because this wasn't about going viral. This wasn't about her being a struggling waitress. This was about a moment of human connection that the world so often forgot." As the sun set outside her window, Samantha felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of purpose. Samantha sat in the waiting room of the television studio, gripping a cup of water that had long since lost its chill. The hum of conversation and the distant clatter of production equipment filled the space, but she barely noticed. Her fingers traced the edges of the folded note in her pocket. Barron Trump's words now etched in her mind. Brighter days are coming. She had spent the past 24 hours wrestling with whether she should even be here. The thought of sitting in front of millions of viewers, of having her life dissected by strangers, had sent her stomach into knots. But deep down she knew this wasn't about her anymore. This was about kindness, and that was something worth talking about. A producer approached, headset resting around her neck. "Samantha, we're ready for you." Taking a deep breath, she stood, smoothing out the creases in her blouse. This was it. As she stepped onto the brightly lit set, she was met with a warm smile from the host, a seasoned journalist known for her empathetic interviews. The audience clapped politely, but Samantha barely heard it over the sound of her own heartbeat. She sat down, placing her hands in her lap, fingers tightly intertwined. The host leaned forward. Samantha, your story has touched so many people over the past few days. Can you take us back to that moment in the cafe? What was going through your mind when you found the note? Samantha exhaled slowly. Honestly, at first I thought it was just a generous tip. I've had wealthy customers before, and sometimes they leave big tips because it's nothing to them. But when I read what he wrote, it was different. She hesitated, then continued. It wasn't just about the money. It was the fact that he saw me, that he understood something I didn't even say out loud. And in that moment, I felt like I wasn't alone. The host nodded. The note read, "Your kindness and hard work don't go unnoticed. My family has been where you are. Stay strong. Brighter days are coming." What do you think he meant by that? Samantha glanced down at her hands, gathering her thoughts. I think he meant that struggle is universal. It doesn't matter how much money you have or where you come from. Everyone faces hard times. But sometimes, all it takes is one person reminding you to hold on, to believe that things can get better. And that's what he did for me. The audience was silent, hanging on to her every word. The host smiled. That's a beautiful message. If Barron Trump were watching right now, is there anything you'd like to say to him? A lump formed in Samantha's throat, but she swallowed it down and lifted her gaze. Just thank you, not for the tip, but for reminding me that kindness still exists, that even in a world that feels cold sometimes, there are people who care, and that means more than I can ever put into words. The interview wrapped up soon after, but Samantha's story didn't end there. When she stepped outside the studio, she was met with an entirely new reality. The video of her interview was everywhere. It spread across social media, news outlets, and even made its way onto international platforms. The conversation wasn't just about Barron Trump anymore. It was about kindness, about how small gestures could change lives. Messages flooded Samantha's inbox, strangers sharing their own stories of struggle, people inspired to pay forward acts of generosity. Donations began pouring into charities that helped service workers and struggling families. The ripple effect was undeniable. But perhaps the most unexpected moment came a few days later. Samantha was finishing her shift at the cafe, wiping down tables as the evening crowd thinned out. The last customer had just left when the bell over the door chimed. She glanced up, expecting another late-night guest. Instead, Barron Trump stood there. She froze. He was dressed simply, just as he had been the first time, hands in his pockets, expression calm. "Hey," he said, offering a small smile. Samantha's heart pounded. "Hi." For a moment there was silence, and then he gestured toward an empty table. "Mind if I sit?" She nodded, still trying to process what was happening. As he slid into the seat, she cautiously joined him. "I saw your interview," he said, leaning forward slightly. "You handled it really well." She let out a nervous laugh. "Thanks. I wasn't sure if I should do it, but I didn't want the message to get lost." Barron nodded, studying her for a moment. "I didn't expect any of this to blow up the way it did. I just wrote what I felt." Samantha met his gaze. "That's why it mattered." A slow, knowing smile spread across his face. "I guess so." For the next few minutes they talked. Not about the headlines, not about the attention, but about life, about work, about struggles, about the little things people don't usually talk about with strangers. And by the time he stood to leave, Samantha realized something. This wasn't just a moment. It was a movement. As Barron pulled his coat on, he glanced back at her. "Keep going. You never know whose life you might change just by being you." She smiled. "You too." And with that he was gone. That night, as Samantha lay in bed, she reached for the note, tracing the words one last time before slipping it into her wallet. A permanent reminder that small gestures can have the biggest impact. Kindness was never just about grand gestures or viral moments. It was about seeing people and making sure they knew they weren't alone. At the heart of this story is a powerful message about kindness, recognition, and human connection. While the characters in this story are fictional, the lesson is very real. Sometimes the smallest gestures can create the biggest impact. A kind word, a helping hand, or simply acknowledging someone's struggles can make all the difference in their journey. In a world that often feels fast-paced and indifferent, stories like these remind us of something essential. Everyone wants to be seen, to be valued, and to be reminded that they are not alone. Whether it's a note of encouragement, a small act of generosity, or simply taking the time to listen, kindness is a ripple that can spread far beyond what we imagine. So, as you go about your day, take a moment to ask yourself, who can you uplift today? A friend, a stranger, a loved one? Because the truth is, brighter days are coming, but sometimes we need to help each other see them. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you find today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create better videos that match your interests. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.